When it comes to true crime mysteries, most of the time the answer is found relatively quickly by relatively conventional means. But some of the strangest mysteries need unusual or unexpected turns in order to be solved. Number 5. When the true crime case of Jeanette Kirby began, there were only a handful of clues for detectives to work with. Jeanette's body was discovered on June 12, 1986, near Riverbend Park in Ingham County. She hadn't been seen since the day before when she left for a jog, and it was only when she missed a breakfast date the day after that anyone realized she was missing. It had rained the day before, and any footprints, fingerprints, or other evidence had been washed away. One thing that did remain was the flex cuffs that the criminal had used to restrain her wrist. Flex cuffs were commonly used by law enforcement, so there was a fear that the criminal might have been a police officer. But beyond that, there were no leads as to who could have committed the crime. It wasn't until 4 years later that the police were able to identify a suspect, and even then it seemed like a long shot. A man named David Draheim had attempted to abduct a woman after he had impersonated a police officer to pull her over, complete with an Ingham County sheriff's hat, and used flex cuffs to restrain her. But the woman managed to get away. Draheim had previously had no criminal record and volunteered as a volunteer firefighter, but he was imprisoned for the attempted abduction. There were some similarities in the case, but the type of flex cuffs was different, and it had happened 200 miles away. With no way to actually link Draheim to Jeanette's case, the case went cold. It was reopened more than a decade later after campaigning by Jeanette's mother. With little else to go on, detectives interviewed acquaintances of Draheim's from the time of the crime. One of those was Mark Greco, who had been Draheim's roommate at the time. Mark and Draheim both worked as security guards together, but Mark did some other odd jobs. At one point, he was restoring an old police car when he found some old flex cuffs. He used one pair on a hat that was part of his uniform and gave the rest to Draheim. Remarkably, Mark still had the hat in a storage unit. When investigators examined the flex cuff, they found it was from the same batch as the one that had been used to restrain Jeanette. This unexpected piece of evidence was finally enough to arrest Draheim for the crime. After the arrest, other women came forward with occasions that Draheim had tried to restrain them in a similar fashion. And in 2002, he was found guilty of taking Jeanette's life. Number 4. For decades, Tim Slayton looked for answers in the unsolved crime of his mother's passing. He never expected the person responsible would have been the man that featured in a photo of his school football team he'd had at his house all that time. Linda Slayton was 31 years old in 1981. She was a single mother with 2 sons, Tim, who was 12, and Jeff, who was 15. On the morning of September 4th, Linda's sister came to her Lakeland, Florida home for coffee, like they had planned. Linda didn't come to the door. The sister went into the house to find Linda's lifeless body in her bedroom. Someone had taken her life while her sons slept in the other room. Police were able to collect DNA and fingerprints from the crime scene, but it didn't match anybody already in the database. They interviewed everyone who would have seen Linda that night, including Joseph Clinton Mills. Mills was a young man in his early 20s who coached Tim's football team. On the night of the attack, he had driven Tim home from practice, which wasn't anything out of the ordinary. Linda had come to the car to thank him, and that had been the end of the interaction. The case quickly went cold without any leads to follow, but the Slayton brothers never stopped looking for answers. Decades later, with the advent of genetic genealogy, detectives decided to take another look at the DNA that had been collected from Linda's home. Using DNA submitted to ancestry websites, detectives were able to build a family tree of the person responsible for the crime. The family tree led investigators to Joseph Mills, who was now in his 60s. Confirmation was still needed that this was the man investigators were looking for. Trash was collected from Mills' home, and DNA was compared to that found at the scene. The 2 samples matched up. Once Mills was arrested, his fingerprints were taken and compared to those found in Linda's bedroom. His story that he had never entered the Slayton family home was clearly false. At first, he tried to claim that he'd been in a consensual relationship with Linda, and that she was still very much alive when he left, but he eventually pleaded guilty to try to avoid a harsher sentence. The reason why Mills committed this completely out-of-the-blue crime has never been revealed. Tim described him as the last person on his radar. While the family now has answers to this strange mystery, the question of why will always remain. Number 3. Oftentimes, with true crime mysteries, there isn't much of a mystery at all. It's often easy to see who committed the crime, but getting evidence for that is a difficult matter. In the case of Loreta Jones, what was so unexpected about her case wasn't who committed the crime, but how the case was solved. Loreta was a 23-year-old single mother who suffered multiple wounds from a bladed weapon and passed away on the night of July 29, 1970. Her daughter found her the following morning and alerted a neighbor who contacted police. Tom Egley quickly became the primary suspect. Loreta's daughter had heard a man's voice the night before and told her grandmother that it sounded like her mother's friend, Tom. Egley was the only Tom Loreta had mentioned in her diary. They'd been dating for a few months but were no longer together. Egley was then arrested for an attempted abduction the same day Loreta was attacked. The person he tried to abduct identified him from a lineup. Police believed the two crimes were committed by the same person. It seemed too much of a coincidence for two violent crimes to have happened on the same day so nearby. But there was no evidence linking Egley to Loreta's passing. DNA evidence couldn't confirm Egley was the person responsible, and eventually the case went cold. Over the years, the files connected to Loreta's case were lost, along with any evidence that was connected. At this point, it seemed impossible Loreta would ever get justice. Her daughter Heidi reached out to an investigator years later. The investigator gathered what remained, which mostly consisted of press clippings. There was one crime scene photo, a rather strange-looking picture Heidi had taken at the scene before it had been cleaned up. Why someone would take such a morbid picture is a mystery, but it would provide a valuable clue. Loreta had written the criminal's name on the carpet as life slipped away from her. The letters T and O were clear in the dark stain that was left on the carpet. Now investigators knew they weren't just working on the word of a child who may have misidentified a man's voice, and a possible coincidence, but it still wouldn't have been enough to get Egley. Loreta's body was exhumed in the hope that it might provide more evidence, but after decades, any evidence that remained when she was buried had disappeared. What it did do was add publicity to the case, and a neighbor of Egley offered to wear a wire and talk to him until he confessed. Unexpectedly, this unusual approach worked. The exhumation and news from the new investigation scared him, and he confessed to taking Loreta's life after they got into an argument. He later handed himself in to police and would eventually get a sentence of 10 years to life in prison. Number 2. For 30 years, a heavy barrel sat in the crawl space of a house in Jericho, Long Island. The house had changed hands a number of times, but the barrel remained. It wasn't until 1999 that someone finally thought to get rid of the thing. Sanitation workers said that it was too heavy to take, so the barrel was opened and the mummified remains of a young woman were discovered. For 30 years, this young woman had been forgotten about. It didn't take long after the woman was discovered for authorities to locate the criminal responsible. There had only been 3 other owners before the person who was getting rid of the barrel. The second owner said that the barrel had been there when he moved in. He'd put it in the corner of the crawl space and forgotten about it. The first owner was a man named Howard Elkins, who claimed to have no knowledge of it. It would have been possible for the barrel to have been placed in the home by someone other than the owners, but the contents of the barrel indicated that Elkins was responsible. Along with the woman, there was green dye, plastic pellets, and the stem of a fake flower. Examining the dye and pellets, it was discovered both were used in the manufacturing of fake plants. Elkins had run a factory that made fake plants, and there were rumors that he'd been having an affair with one of his employees. Elkins was in his 70s by the time the body was discovered. When questioned by police, he admitted to the relationship, but couldn't name the woman and denied taking her life. Police left him to get a warrant for a DNA test, and he took his own life the following day. The case now became one of solving the mystery of who this young woman was. Records from the factory were long gone, and she didn't match any missing person from the area. An examination showed that she'd had dentistry work, which was likely done in South America, which only meant finding her identity would be even more difficult. Eventually, police managed to get a breakthrough. Found in the barrel with her was an unused address book. The writing had faded long ago, but a video spectral comparator was used to show what had been written. Only some names, addresses, and numbers could be revealed. Given the amount of time that had passed, it wasn't surprising that many of the people no longer lived at those addresses or had those numbers. But finally, a woman named Kathy was contacted. Kathy told police about a woman named Reina Marican. Reina had been an immigrant from El Salvador who had come to the US to make something of herself. Kathy had been teaching her English and was good friends with the woman. She knew Reina had been having an affair with a married man, but didn't know who that was. In 1969, Reina had told the man's wife about the affair, and he had threatened her. She called Kathy to tell her what had happened, but by the time Kathy had gone to Reina's apartment, Reina was gone. Kathy tried to get authorities involved that same day, but the disappearance was brushed off as Reina running away with her boyfriend. She had known at the time that that wasn't true, but now she was certain. Reina's family in El Salvador were contacted. They too had been trying to solve the mystery of what had happened to their missing loved one. She'd written to them throughout her time in America, but when the letters stopped, they didn't know what to do. The disappearance and crime now finally have answers. The only real mystery in this case now is how Elkins got away with his crime for so long. Number 1. A true crime story that took place in Montrose, Pennsylvania, sounds more like the plot from a hospital soap opera than a real-life crime mystery. Dr. Stephen Scher was twice found guilty of taking the life of his best friend, Martin Dillon, in one of the strangest crimes. Martin was from a well-respected family. His father had once been mayor of the town, and he worked as a lawyer. His wife, Patricia, worked as a nurse at the local hospital with Scher, who was a relative newcomer to the community. Martin was aware of the fact his wife and best friend had been having an affair, and confronted Patricia about this, making her choose between the two of them. She chose Martin, something Scher was obviously unhappy about, but it seemed like this wasn't enough to end their friendship. On June 2nd, 1976, the two friends went skeet shooting. There was a tragic accident. Martin tripped while chasing a porcupine, setting off his weapon and hitting himself in the chest, and Scher could not save him. Police quickly determined it really had been an accident. The Dillon family weren't happy with this assessment, but the case was closed. Scher seemed to have taken the tragedy well enough. He divorced his wife and married Patricia. Patricia and Martin already had 2 children together, so Scher raised them as his own. They moved out of state, and Scher continued to practice medicine. What was most unexpected about this case was how long it took for an investigation to actually begin. It wasn't until 20 years later that the Dillon family finally managed to get authorities to re-examine the case. The body was exhumed, and an autopsy showed that it was impossible for the wound to have been self-inflicted. Scher was arrested and confessed to taking the life of his friend, but he instead said that it was in self-defense. Martin had attacked him, and in the struggle, the weapon had gone off. This story was even backed up by a babysitter who had allegedly overheard Martin talking about taking Scher's life and how easy it would have been to get away with it. He was found guilty and imprisoned a few years before an appeal led to his release. Another trial was held, this time with even more evidence, and it was found that there hadn't been a struggle. Instead, Martin had been attacked while he was crouched over loading clay pigeons into the machine. Scher was again found guilty, and again sentenced to prison where he passed away from natural causes. Thank you guys so much for watching. If you liked this video, be sure to hit that like button. Also, don't forget to subscribe and click that notification bell to keep up to date with all of our future uploads. But I've been Ty Knotts, and I'll catch you guys in the next video.